Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'll be demonstrating this mountain scene. Recently I've been practicing mountains, something that I haven't really painted much of in the past, but I'm really beginning to enjoy finding out some nice sort of simple ways to get them to look really effective. Today's mountains are based on the beautiful Wanaca Mountains in New Zealand. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, using a photograph that I found on Pixabay. And I believe that these majestic mountains were the location for some of the filming of The Hobbit, and I can understand why. So if you want to see the reference image, then please follow the link below, but I've changed it substantially. And I've left out a very large foreground tree because I wanted to focus completely on the mountains. The first thing I did was to sketch it out really simply in pencil, trying to make sure that I sketched in each separate mountain peak so that I can then build them up in a sort of a layered way and achieve the depth and distance and aerial perspective that I need. I'm using Milford 100% cold pressed watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. I'm going to use the wet in wet method to start with, so I'm using a large wash brush to wet the sky all over. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite synthetic mottler brush, 1.5 inches, but any large wash brush will do. Then I shall mix up a nice clear blue sky mix using cobalt blue with a touch of cerulean just to give it that sort of cooler feel. But I'll also add a little bit of lavender to grey the colour down a little too as I come down to the horizon. Then I shall come into the lake and, using the slightly greyer mix, paint that in too. I've added a touch of light red and burnt sienna to my sky colour, and I'm dragging it across the mountains just to start off a bit of greyish tone there and across the water. Now I'm going to change to a round brush, a size 14 round, and I've got a mixture of raw sienna and burnt sienna with a touch of sepia in it, and I'm just bringing up some tree shapes for this headland just before you get to the mountains, that's covered in these beautiful sort of autumnal trees, which should make a really nice contrast to the blues and greys in the rest of the scene. If I put them in wet, they'll diffuse really nicely, and I can drag down reflections as well vertically from those tree shapes, and that will soften and diffuse and just really give me some lovely distant or midground effects. And just before I leave it to dry, I'm using a clean damp flat brush to carefully lift out a pale line between the mountains and the water, and the headlands and the water. And then using my palette knife, or you could use the corner of a plastic store card, I'm scraping through the damp paint here with some vertical lines, and they will just show some slight highlights as it dries, where I'm scraping back to the paler paper beneath, and that just shows a little bit of light catching on the trees and the tree trunks and branches. Now I'm going to leave it to dry completely. So here's the dry painting. I'm now going to start to paint in the mountains. So I'm going to use my size 14 round brush, and I've mixed up a well full of, with a sort of variety of very similar colours that I've mixed up from cobalt blue, light red, burnt sienna and raw sienna. Possibly a touch of Payne's grey here and there, and the idea is to build up my mountain shapes using a bit of variety. So I'm bringing across this sort of cooler greyish colour right behind those lovely warm trees on the left. And then behind that I'm going to paint in some slightly warmer mountains. And I'll work like this, sort of alternating very slightly the colours that I'm using for this mountain, so that I can build up this sense of layers and layers of mountain stretching back to the background, and then finally leaving the white of the paper on the distant mountains in places where they're catching the sun on the snowy slopes. So I'm almost there, and now I'm at the stage where I'm going to paint around the white of the paper to leave those snowy distant slopes of the highest, most distant mountains. Sorry that my hand's in the way, that's just the way that my camera has to be set up for filming. But as you can see here, I'm using a small calligraphy brush, but any small brush with a good point will do, to strengthen up some of the colour in the autumn trees on that headland there. Just putting a little bit of definition, painting in sort of wet onto the dry painting, so we get some nice hard edges, which I can soften back with my finger if I need to. Just sort of putting in place a darker edge to this headland where it meets the beach and the water, and just a little bit of suggested definition to some of the clumps of trees. I've made up a mid value just to put in a bit of sepia, Payne's grey, and a bit of burnt sienna and a tiny touch of light red. And I'm using my Princeton Aqua Elite modeler brush just to sweep it across horizontally using the tips of the brush and the belly of the brush in places. I want to get some dry brush and some sort of hit and miss effects here and there so that the sky colour shows through in places to indicate the wet beach and where the sort of water from the lake has kind of come up amongst the stones. And just a few more little dark shadows just to add some tone and therefore some depth and distance to this group of trees. And now to use the size 14 round brush, and I've added some Payne's Grey to my mountain mixture to make it a little bit darker, and I'll paint in this closest headland, or rather it's probably the foothills of a mountain on the right. And then I can balance up the tones in this headland here. And then I'll lift out a little bit of that darker colour close to the waterline just to give the suggestion of some sort of icy sort of mist on the lake in the distance. Well, I think I'm just about there. I might need to do a bit more in the foreground, but I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it and see how it looks with its clean white border. This allows me to sort of see it with fresh eyes, and I can actually see it and see whether it needs anything else adding to it. I think I'm just about happy with this. I'm very happy with the mountains, but I just think I'm going to fiddle about a little bit with the beach and just add a few darks. Introducing darks and maybe sort of blotting them out a little bit, trying to give the impression of some stones in the foreground, but trying to make sure that they don't distract too much, but just help to lead the eye into the painting. It's tempting to play around with the water and maybe try and add a few more reflections, but the water wasn't my goal today. The mountains were my focus, and I think if I start playing around with the water, I could risk overworking the painting or creating a distraction from the mountains. As it is, I think, with the mountains making a lovely contrast against the water and against the sky, I think it works really nicely, and I'm really pleased with the way this method worked for painting the snowy peaks in the distance. Well, thank you very much for joining me again in the studio. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed the video, then please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, because this really sends a strong message to the YouTube algorithm that you're interested in seeing more from us. And thank you so much to everyone that supports the channel via the Super Thanks or via Patreon. We really do appreciate you. Many thanks again, and I'll see you soon, and have a lovely weekend and happy painting.